Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malaman in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet. And joining me are my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter, Day School, Long Island, and Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky at Anshe Chesed in New York City. It's great to see you. We have an amazing Parsha. This is Parasha Noah, the second Parsha in the Torah. We got a good start with Breshit, but now things seem to be going steadily, swiftly downhill or underwater. Noah. Tell us about Noah. What strikes you about the character of Noah, Barry Chesler?
No, I think we have to go to the beginning of the Parsha, obviously. He's described as Ish Tzaddik B'Toratov, a righteous person in his generation. And the rabbis pick up on the apparently superfluous word B'Toratov in his generations and the rabbis collectively offer two interpretations. One is that he is righteous in his generation, but that he lived in another generation, such as that of Abraham, he would not be so righteous, because in the world of the blind, a one-eyed person sees far, is the image that Rashi quotes. And the second one is that, in fact, Noah is perhaps even greater than Abraham because he had no role models. And humanity was so deficient that he had to struggle mightily to become righteous in his generation. And like a lot of other rabbinic discussions of this kind, it's not actually resolved here, although there are other comments later in the Parsha that suggest that Noah, in fact, is inferior to Abraham. I suppose that's our bias as Jewish readers of the Hebrew scripture. But I think that when we look at Noah, we're reminded that there's a fine line between pathos and being pathetic. That on one hand, we want to empathize with Noah, but on the other hand, we find him seriously wanting.
What do you think is, as a statement about human behavior and human society, which of those two things rings true with you? That you know, like we tend to measure people against their contemporaries, and you know, somebody can be the best of a bad lot, or maybe it takes some really great moral fiber and virtue to be good in a bad world. Maybe that shows that somebody's gotten more in their resource kit, in their toolkit, than some. It's easy to be righteous when the world is righteous. What do you think?
I'm reminded of the phrase, I guess, in Tehillim, maybe it is, where, you know, Yaftach, well, actually, it's a rabbinic comment, Yaftach Bedoro Kashmuel Bedoro, or something like that. That Yaftach, who was a singularly wanting judge, although a brilliant military tactician and strategist, that's who we had in his generation. And then we had Shmuel in his generation, who was far superior, but you don't get to choose. In other words, you have to play the hand that you're dealt. And for the generation of Noah, Noah was the ace of spades.
Yeah, I find it appealing to think that that it takes real effort to be even partially good in a bad world. Like, I find it appealing to think that Noah, if everybody around him was doing X or Y or Z, the ability to resist that speaks well of your character.
You know, it's very interesting. You know, our experiences with teaching this to a certain age group, 13, 14, and of course, peer pressure is really paramount in those ages, as they would be, I guess, you know, in some way later on in life. And kids could relate to this, that to break away from your peer group and to differentiate yourself from your peers it actually takes quite an extraordinary amount of courage, of strength. So, you know, what is it that defines him as Tzaddik? Et Elohim italech Noah. He walks with God. There's something that is godly about him. There's something that God likes about him. At least we get the sense that God prefers or will turn to him as opposed to anybody else, because God has tremendous disappointment in the world. And let's take a moment to talk about that. Jeremy, you know. Well,
the Parshat Breshit, you know, is very finely, the parshiot break up the way they do, post-biblical. The Bible doesn't divide into parshiot. Bible doesn't even divide into chapters. It's later readers who did that. But Breshit is a very finely wrought creation because it starts off with Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov me'od. Like God looks at all that God has done, and it's very good. And the letters tov me'od, as the Midrash says, you scramble up the letters, you get tov adam. People are good. But by the end of the parsha, it's Vayit Yatzev Libo. God is sorry he ever made these stupid people, and they're rak kol hayom. They're just ra. They're just bad all day long. So Breshit goes from very promising beginning to a very great disappointing end. And the image of Noah. I mean, this is why I'm not saying anything that's not been said a gazillion times before, but the reason why Noah, strikes me as deficient is I can't quite imagine how walking with God but ignoring people is a good path, right? I mean, Noah is told the world's terrible and I'm going to wash it all away and start all over again. And he doesn't appear to, or at least the Torah does not describe him as turning to his fellow human beings and saying, guys, we better do something. He's like saving himself.
So I want to take issue with that a little bit. I think that that's a common refrain, is to think that the person didn't do enough. I mean, we've all been in that situation and we've seen people in that situation, but the people are incredibly bad. The word that's used in Hebrew is hishchit, nishchata, lishachet. Like every form of corruption seems to embody the people. And I don't think that Noah or anyone else could be successful in that environment working with the people. And that's why he doesn't deal with them.
That's not entirely satisfying to me because it certainly may be true. And maybe the Bible is, bringing home the story that God has given up on the people. The world is, as you said, that it's nishchat and this full of Hamas and all of the badness. But we do have, we're not so long away from Yom Kippur, in which Yonah ben Amittai walks into the middle of Nineveh, the worst place on earth, and says, 40 days and you're all going to be overthrown. And they go, oh my God, let's turn this thing around. And Abraham, because Noah and Abraham are always paired. It's hard not to think about that not too long away when Abraham is going to, God says, the stone, I just got to get rid of these people. And Abraham says, wait a minute, can we think twice about this one? And Noah, I find Noah's obedience admirable, but it's just a little hard for me to not think that the Torah, in telling the story, should give us a person who, maybe build a bigger boat and take a few people with you.
Does no one know that everybody's going to be destroyed? God says, "Vakimoti et briti itach." I'm going to uphold my covenant with you. So he's basically saying, "Hineni mevir et hamabur mayim al haaretz l'shachet kol basar," to destroy everything. Vakimoti et briti itach, I will maintain a covenant with you, or sustain a covenant with you. Uvata ata el hateva, ata uvanecha v'ishtecha v'neshei vanecha itach. So you're going to have a family in there, and so Noah then has the understanding of the world in terms of his core nuclear family, that is him, his wife, his 3 sons, and their daughters, and from that they're going to rebuild the world. To what extent does that really penetrate his consciousness?
So, obviously this is the story that he is the second Adam. It is God washing the filthiness of the world away, and that's powerful. But I just want to say, just today happens to be that I went to go visit one of my congregants, Yocheved Mufs, the widow of the late Yochanan Mufs, and she's 94 years old, and so they have a bunch of books, and she pressed me to take several copies of Love and Joy and Yochanan's essays. And Yochanan, his probably most famous essay is about the prophet as the person who stands in the breach arguing on behalf of the people towards God and arguing on behalf of God towards the people and mediating that relationship between an angry divine and a faithless people and working it out, prevents God from destroying the people, prevents the people from argues the people that they've got to reorient towards the divine. And the prophet is that hinge figure. Moshe, God says to Moshe all the time, that's the hell with these people, I'm starting again with you. And Moshe always says, no, thank you. Noach says, God says to Noach, the hell with these people, I'm going to start again with you. And Noach says, okay. So what seems to me, in the context of biblical prophecy, in the context of biblical theology and religious relationship, is that Noah is an obedient guy and not a prophet, not somebody who's playing that role of trying to orient the divine and the people to each other, which, by the way, like as Barry said, may be the appropriate answer for this destroyed, corrupt world. But it's very different than what will be the case with the people we will know as the prophets of Israel.
So this becomes, in light of the later stories, this becomes troubling about the character of Noah, that he doesn't protest, that he goes along, and that he understands the world as God is telling him, and why wouldn't he do that? And that the world that God is telling him is the world that will be created with you, that you will be the progenitor of the next world.
I have to push back again. I think that sometimes we minimize the strength and the character that it takes to hear the voice of God, which I think in real life is never as clear as it is in the Torah itself, where it just says God spoke, and apparently the human being listens. And I think we have to imagine Noah in this world where people are bad, and they're bad every day. It's not like they're taking a break to be good for a few years or a few months or a few weeks even. They're described as being irredeemably bad. And Noah is given his commandment to build the ark. And by building the ark, I think if we follow the rabbis, people are invited to ask him, why are you doing this? And there is some buy-in, but you can't beat people over the head.
I just want to say one thing about the divine in this story. It's like, we are accustomed to thinking, and this is real, this is a real religious orientation. We're accustomed to thinking about the perfection of the divine, and God is a paradigm for goodness and a paradigm for all kinds of either metaphysical or moral goodness. And it's interesting to me that the very beginning of the Torah, as I think describes biblical, religion, like God's magnificent creation turned out to stink. Like God is regretting, we say, of course, God is, Shmuel says, is God a person that can change his mind? No, of course not. Well, actually, yes, the Bible says God changed his mind. I'm sorry I did this, and this turned out awful, and I'm going to crumple it up and start all over again. I think it's an interesting religious feature of the portrait of the divine in these first chapters of Breshit, that God is not seen to be like, maybe Breshit Aleph, yes, but not in these other passages that are much more fraught with failure.
Okay, so that God tells Noah to go into the ark. Bo ata v'chol beitcha el hateva. Take you go and your whole household. And then verse 7 of chapter 7. Vayavo Noach ubanav v'ishto unashei vanav ito. Noach and his sons go, and his wife and the wives of his sons go. And that prompts the idea that Noah goes with his sons and his wife goes with his daughters-in-law, prompts the rabbis to make the following midrash, that during the course of the year, life is frozen. There's a kippa'on. There is just a freezing of all human relations, that in fact, no relations take place between anyone on the boat, and that there is a separation between the two, between Noah and his wife and his sons' wives and his sons. And then of course, I'm leading to the fact that in the end, when God says to Noah, you and your wife, it's a subtle way of the Torah telling us, we want you to renew your relationship. We want you to renew a living relationship. And at that point,
let's say the next part, yeah.
Okay, and so at that point, Noah goes out, Vayetze Noach uvanav. But Noah goes out with his son. So let me recap, so that because it's complicated. God says, go in with your family, and Noah goes in, they go in basically with a mechitza, okay? And then go out without a mechitza. But Noah still goes out with a mechitza. In other words, there is no sense that he wants to renew the relationship here, and whether or not that fullness of human relationships will exist afterwards.
Right, but how could he? I mean, look at the world that he's going out into. It's a world that has been completely destroyed. Everything he knew is gone. Why would he think that anything from the old world is going to be valid in the new world, including the relations with his wife?
Do you think that it's interesting because of the, going 2 by 2s. So the sustenance of animal life is supposed to be you take a male and a female and you put them on the boat, and then is it they will be animals and they will have sex and reproduce on the boat, or do we think it is like exactly as you just said, Elliot? They go in males alone, females alone. Then God says, go out male and female, and they don't follow that. They're too traumatized or too, disbelieving or whatever, and they go out males alone and females alone. But how does that match up to a story that is, Zachar Nekeva for all the animals?
Okay, so I think the story works mythologically in that it's a freezing of life. I've talked about this before, that the boat itself is shaped like a sarcophagus, and that it's really a death and a relife. So that, or the resuscitation, that I think the idea of everything on the boat being in suspended animation for it's a year what is it? A year and a month, right? But they don't go out till the 27th day of the second month. So it's actually close to 13 months, 14 months of being inside the boat. And so things are suspended. And yeah, nobody's having sex on the boat.
It's not the love boat.
This is not the love boat.
Speaking, how would it work? I mean, the boat is finite. You imagine when they all get on the boat at the beginning before the rain start, that it's full.
Yes.
And you can't imagine that it can become more full in the course of the year, especially when you think about it, what else is there to do practically?
They had the internet. I think they had Wi-Fi, but you
have to think, as Elliot suggested, that it is a suspended life, that they're going into this boat and they're freezing time.
Okay. That's really very persuasive that they are freezing time. I like that. I like that a lot. I hadn't thought about that, because you don't have. Then you ask yourself, well, where's all the food and how do they clean out the cages and stuff like that? But no, it's just a frozen thing, and it reminds me of the climax or the conclusion of Moby Dick, where Yishmael is saved by floating in a coffin, and so I think this works really powerfly here.
So take Noah then as the paradigm of the survivor, which we want to talk about, because here. We want to address Noah with I think a great deal of sympathy. His whole world is destroyed. He really didn't know how to relate to other people prior to the flood. It's only him and his family. He's been promised to regenerate all of human civilization, and I think it's too overwhelming for him. I mean, can you give me a critical or sympathetic reading of what happens to Noah afterwards? Jeremy, just tell our listeners what actually happens when he goes. So first of all, it takes him an awful lot of time to get out of the boat. He doesn't want to get out of the boat.
Yeah, he doesn't want
to get him out of the boat. Get back to life. And he goes back he goes back still with, his relationship with his sons. God promises him they make the covenant, etc. And we'll move to the very next scene, which is the scene where Noah is now Ish HaAdama. We have gone from Noah Ish Tzaddik to Noah Ish HaAdama. It's not to be pejorative about a man of the earth. Men of the earth, people of the earth are good people. They are productive people, but they there's something about earthy people. They don't.
Well, before we get to the Ish HaAdama, which is really it's incredibly important in the way that you're saying, because first of all, from Adam, Noah is a replication, a new Adam, perhaps a new line. Adam, having rebelled, says the ground is cursed, and I think it's the earth, like the planet, or just the ground, is cursed because of you. And then God says upon Noah leaving the ark, Lo osif lekalel od et ha'adama ba'avur ha'adam. I will no longer curse the earth because of the human being. And so perhaps Noah rolls away that curse a little bit, but Noah does something also before that, which is that he offers an animal sacrifice.
A set of animal sacrifice, a whole.
Yeah. Noah Uvanav, Noah and his sons leave, V'ishto and Shevanavito, and the women leave, and all the animals are with them. And Noah builds an altar to the Lord and takes from all the pure animals and from all the pure birds, which I think we Jews understand those to be the kosher ones, and offers sacrifices on the altar. And God smells the pleasing aroma, Vayarach Adonai et reach hanichoach. And then God says, I'm not going to curse I'm not going to curse the ground because of the human being anymore. Listen, they're pretty weak creatures, but I'm not going to destroy them anymore. I'm not going to bring another flood, and the seasons are going to be regular, and people can rely on things to just live life on this new planet. And I think that is a lovely scene of Noah's gratitude for rescue and Noah's sort of orientation to the divine in a proper way. It's not kind of, the rabbis have a lovely little line about this. It's not quite unrelated to what comes next about the being a man of the earth, which is that God can, like, the description of the Midrash is, God can be intoxicated also. Like anybody who likes wine, the sages say, is a little bit like God, who can also be intoxicated by smelling the reach nichoach, which that's like God's catnip. That's just God's favorite perfume, and God's relents from some of the harshness. So I like Noah as the grateful, worshipful person upon being saved. Maybe the animal.
Okay, so then the next scene, is there a transition? God says, "Pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply, umilu et haaretz," and well, we're going to fast forward, and Noah ends up naked in the tent by himself, I guess. We'll see. But the transition from Noah as the grateful, worshipful, survivor, but he's also got to confront the destroyed world. And this is where I think we have tremendous sympathy. I'm going, Barry, come and chime in. Go ahead.
Well, what I'd like to suggest is that the background here is a broken relationship between Noah and God. That after the flood, God is no longer trustworthy. He talks a good game. I'll make a covenant with you. And this covenant, the foundation of any covenant is an element of trust. But how can you trust someone who's just destroyed the world? Words alone are not going to do it. So I sense that there's a degree of discomfort that Noah is feeling his way. So as a farmer, he's going to plant the vineyard. He's going to have a cup of wine because, as he will learn from Tehillim, wine makes the heart glad.
It's Rosh Chodesh today. He said Psalm 104 today.
So, and perhaps he overdoes it. I think I mentioned this last year. One of my favorite comments that says Vayesh min hayayin, that he drank from the wine. So this one commentator says that his sin here is that he drank the same kind of wine he would have drunk before the flood, without taking into account that the world, and by extension, he himself, had changed. And he no longer was as strong as he had been, as who could be if the entire world has been destroyed. And so trying to live like he did in the old days, he failed in the new days.
So on the one hand, we have, I think, a tremendous amount of sympathy for Noah because he is that survivor and he really doesn't know how to cope with that world. On the other hand, I don't want to say that there's some judgment here, but there are different models of survivors. There are, we are 80 years after the great Mabul Adamim, and there were certainly people and individuals who were so shattered by their experiences, they could not go back to their lives. Their lives were destroyed, their families were destroyed, and they just weren't able to pick up any of the pieces, understandably. And then there were people who built, entire lives, entire communities, entire businesses. Arguably, some of the most creative individuals in the state of Israel were from that generation. I was listening before to Benny Lau, who talked about Itzik Manger, Yiddish poet, who after the Holocaust had nobody, was completely destroyed, and was lying alone in his in a place, a godforsaken place in some residence in Tel Aviv or outside of Tel Aviv, and saying, "Ich bin Noach, I am Noach, I am Noach, I am after the flood, I have nothing," and he was drinking himself to death, basically. And on the one hand, you don't blame a person like that. I mean, on the other hand, there were people who had tremendous human fortitude to be able to pick up and do their lives and redo their lives.
I suspect that the higher numbers were not among the survivors that became productive, but were among the survivors who survived physically but were profoundly damaged. But we don't hear their stories in the same way.
Sure.
They're part of the Jews of silence, which we used to refer to something else, but they also are a generation that we didn't necessarily address. And it's worth noting that there were organizations in Israel devoted to working with the Holocaust survivors. One of the most famous being Amcha, which was later used for an organization here in the United States. And it was very difficult work.
This is an example, I think, of, this is a story which obviously our people have been reading, for thousands of years, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years, and it seems to have a very powerful resonance now for people who live after the Shoah. That like all Jewish history wasn't so easy before the Shoah, but this image of like what it takes to be a survivor and the traumatized quality, it's just incredibly vivid. And exactly as you said, Elliot, you did find people who went on and built lives and even became tzaddikim in multiple different ways. Wiesel himself in The Accident, there's the female character. She's she's been driven to prostitution, and she's just an utterly devastated. She's an utterly devastated person. And he said, this is the testimony, is to tell her story. Now, with Noah, it's maybe a teeny bit different, is because the story that the Bible tells is that everyone was bad and deserved their suffering. Noah was good and deserved his rescue. But is it simply like, is Noah the guy who, when the Nazis came to his town, happened to be in the cellar and got passed over and not noticed, and so he was saved by stroke of luck? Or is Noah the guy who got out in 1939 or something like that and has survivor guilt? He didn't deserve that. Or does Noah just like, he is the good guy. He is the tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav, who somehow deserves this new beginning. I don't know.
Well, I think he's all of those people. But Torah wants him to be tzaddik b'dorotav because the Torah wants God to be shaping his destiny. And I think that one of the things that we didn't really discuss, but also is beneath the surface here is we criticize Noah, who I think invites a fair amount of criticism, but we actually can't really think of anyone who certainly would have acted better.
Okay.
Right? We want to say that we would have acted better, but I think the circumstance was so great that Noah really is the Adam. He is the man. This is what how a human being reacts in a situation like this. There isn't a second choice.
Let me offer this one, okay, which is Noah after the flood, different from Noah before the flood. I think that we can all agree on. But Noah acts with a certain amount of defiance. God says, pru or vu. I mean, Noah is already 601 years old. There's no pru or vu going to go on there, or maybe there will be. I don't know, in those days, you know, what they were capable of doing at the age of 600, okay? But he certainly doesn't do that. He certainly doesn't engage in what God says that he should be engaged in. So he's the first defiant character. I would say Hevel, which we talked about last week, he's defined in a certain way that Hevel, is not following the letter of the law about tilling the soil. Hevel is eating meat. Noah is not following about pru or vu, and Noah is alone. And there's a proto-defiance in there. And I would just, it's a very important theme to me that Avram, as obedient as Avram, as we can all agree on, Avram, takes God to task on a lot of things. There's a defiance. So there's the seed of defiance in Noah here. I give him, I'm usually very, very critical of Noah. I want to be very sympathetic to him this year. I'm sorry, dear Barry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We have to think of the seed of pru or vu as well, because Noah's sons fill up the world, right? We have two genealogies. We have the genealogy where all these peoples are going to emerge from Shem, Ham, and Yafet. And then at the end of the Parsha, we're going to get the genealogy that's going to lead us to Abraham.
All right,
Yep.
so let's conclude with the genealogies. And Barry, tell us what you find interesting about the genealogies. And you can talk about chapter 10 and chapter 11, excuse me.
Well, I guess there are two things to say. So first of all, we do have the sense that the people after Noah are going to come and fill up the earth, because in the genealogies are not names of individual people as much as are names of peoples, groups of people. That, in other words, there's a lot of population growth here. It's not just one family that's growing bit by bit. It's all of a sudden the earth is full of people. And the other thing I would note is that in the last genealogy, in chapter 11, there is this sense that life has become more normal, that the generations from Adam to Noah are our superheroes. They live incredibly long periods of time. The shortest is 365 and the longest is 969. They have their firstborn son is, they're 90, they're 100, they're 200. And now when we get to this generation from Noah, the genealogy from Noah to Abraham, the childbirth is going to be at what we would consider a normal human age, 25, 30, 35. They're still going to live. They're not going to live quite as long, somewhere between 200 and 400 years. But we have the sense that after the flood, we're more in the world that we know ourselves.
So the only exceptions to that are Shem himself, who's 100, and Terach, who's 70, and Avraham, who is 86 when he first brings forth a child in the world. But everyone from that, Arpach, Shad, Shelach, Ever, Peleg, Reu, Srug, Nachor, they're in that normal human age. So that's a fascinating thing about the genealogies.
I just want to point out that in the course of the first set of genealogies, now I just lost the spot. Yoktan, that's Shem's grandson, I think, maybe great grandson, has some children, Almodad, Shalef, Chatzar Mavet. That's one of the best name in the whole Bible. He's the courtyard of death. Yeah, I should have named one of my children courtyard of death.
After all the people that died in the flood.
What is it? That's a funny name. I happen to be reading Yechezkel, looking for something else, the prophet Yechezkel, and he has this oracle about going down into hell to see the defeated peoples. and they're the names of the people in this genealogy. There's Togarma, and it's the Sidon people is the ones that he's speaking to, and it's Put, Velud, Vitogarma are the people he sees in Shaol, which Meshech and Tuval, and I just think that's tremendously interesting. He's speaking about this list of the mythic early peoples.
Okay, so the Parsha ends, I think, on somewhat of a mixed note, because unlike Noah, where it ends, the Breshit ends with the calamitous outcome of human depravity. This Parsha ends with already the birth of the genealogy of Terach. Terach is 70 years old, and he has Avram, Nachor, and Haran. And then it tells us, what becomes a kind of footnote, but I think it's a very significant piece of information, Vayamot Haran al Pnei Terach Aviv, that Avram is born into a family that experiences this loss, and that the loss of Haran, I think, reshapes the whole story of Avram and Terach, etc. We have, and this we have to leave, there's this whole notion of who this Avram is, what kind of family he comes from, and the backstory, really, which is given to us in just a few verses. We're left really with questions as to what's going to be, what's going to happen, and that's where we have to leave it.
Well, the Terach part is a super interesting part, because when we get to that, so let's see, where are we here in my book? At the end, so Terach, Haran dies al pnei Terach aviv be'eretz moladeto, vayikach Avram v'Nachor. I'm sorry, where's the part where it says vayikach Terach et Avram beno ve'et Lot ben Haran ben beno ve'et Sarai kalato eshet Avram beno. So Terach, Abraham's father, takes Abraham, Sarah, Lot, their whole generation, vayitzu itam me'or kasdim, leaves Or Kasdim, lalechet arza Knaan vayavo ad Haran.
He leaves.
He's heading in the same generation that Abraham is heading, but he doesn't make it. He only makes it to Haran, and then he stops. And we're accustomed to thinking, for a good reason, that Abraham's like the path breaker and he starts something totally new. And it is true, but in some sense, Abraham is being a dutiful son and trying to make the same journey that his father made.
Fascinating. With that, we have to leave it. We leave it on a cliffhanger. We'll see what happens when Abraham is told to go forth next Parsha. It's been great. We want to see you. We want to thank you all for joining us. It's always great to have you with us. We really appreciate your spending some time with the three of us. And on behalf of my buds, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.